So I took that as a kind of starting point, and first because it's not just about movement, of course, but it's also the mold on which you make the shoe that is very important. So I made a specific shoe last, and I worked with a company that is the last manufacturer. A mold for a shoe is called a last in the UK, and found out quite a lot of interesting things. First of all, that the people that work there have very little anatomic understanding of the foot. Something that is really not that necessary, because it's really, the last isn't made for just the foot, but it's also made for the footwear industry. So, for example, the sole of the foot is very flat. That's just because in a factory it's much easier to make a flat material than it is to mold something or to have something more three-dimensional. So all these decisions, they're kind of an amalgamation of what is good for the foot and what the shoe industry needs or requires. And actually, it's probably since the kind of 1850s that shoes even had a left and a right. And we're kind of going back to that again. Even in men's footwear, lasts are becoming more and more kind of ambiguous, non-shoe foot shapes. So here you see the two last, the top one is the new one that I produced, and the bottom one is a kind of more standard last. So this is the last actually that I produced, just physical, but on a kind of rig, because I had to input various measurements in the computer. So I had a physical one that I measured and then translated it to Rhino actually in the computer. So this is one of, I guess, screenshot of the exhibition. So you see here the different last developments, and then behind there I'll explain. So derived from all these different anatomic research, I produced 17 different hypotheses for shoe configurations. And those shoe configurations, they map out all the different contact points. So that what holds the foot or the shoe onto the foot, that what touches the floor, and that what keeps the foot in a high-heeled position. And these contact points, I really designed them from these studies. So every one of these 17 hypotheses has something to do with how we walk or how we move, or how the foot works. And it really completely ignores how any of these shoes are made. Because if you look at a shoe, even if you didn't need a complete strap over your foot, if you just needed like a pinpoint to keep your foot in place, in order to make that possible in the shoe industry means that you need to sandwich and everything that goes over the foot under the sole. So everything goes from under the sole over the foot and back under. So you wouldn't be able to, for example, have a floating strap or even floating dots to keep your foot in place. Does that make sense? I know it's always a bit difficult to explain this process. But yeah, so this is a really kind of conventional structure. So I'll explain with one of the hypotheses. So the foot actually has the heel bone on the side of the foot, really on the outside of the foot. So if you're actually walking on a high heel, which always ends really bang in the middle, it's actually not, you're not standing on your bone, which you might think that you are, but the heel is really on the side of the foot. Also, when we walk barefoot, you see here this line. So when you roll your foot, you actually land on the outside side of the foot where this bone is, and you propel with your big toe. So it really goes through this kind of rolling motion of the foot. You really don't do that, but you go a bit more like that. So from knowing this, I thought, well, if that's the case, then why does a heel really need to be bang in the middle of the foot? Why can't it be on the side? of the foot, and how does that maybe promote a more natural or barefoot way of walking, even though you're, of course, elevated. And then one thing that might, of course, happen is there's eversion and inversion, so your foot also kind of makes that movement, which, of course, if you have a heel on the side of your foot, will kind of happen more easily, because you'll have more to balance with, or you have to balance better. So one thing that I thought of to prevent that from happening is to have some kind of ring around your foot that makes sure that you can't actually make that movement anymore, which looks something like this. And then, of course, I wanted to split the sole so you could, so your foot actually can roll better, because then you're not inhibited by the kind of straightness of the sole. So I inputted that in the computer like this. So this is one of these constellations, or these contact points. But then I also made them into physical parts. So I designed it in such a way that there's an outer shell that these parts sit within that I can then test. So this is one of these outcomes. And then, of course, for the exhibition, I also wanted to aestheticize this kind of research, because it's also quite interesting, our kind of belief in engineering and what it means. So they actually screen printed them, which, again, crazy if you have like really thin dotted lines. Screen printing is not made for that. Plotting is. But 1 in like 20 prints worked. So these are some of the other constellations that I produced. And here you see 5 of them in a row, different positionings. And then I did quite a lot of this research into the working of the foot with the sports science department in Kingston, and they have amazing equipment. So behind here you see all these cameras. They're basically a motion capture set, and they don't unfortunately work like you would imagine in the film industry, but they really work very particularly with the movement of the body, and therefore the imagery that it creates is more like a grainy kind of almost like an X-ray like vision, and then what I wanted to do, which for me was more important, is a pressure map test. So it shows you where your pressure develops from when you walk. So I have some footage of that. So this is a barefoot. So you see this motion, and then the peak toe where you end propelling from. And then the next one is a heel. So it's really high peak pressure moment, and then it rolls to the side and then over. So you can see that you still make that a similar movement as you would do on a high heel, but kind of broken into 2 motions. One, first where you land and then where you propel. So here are some more of these testing pieces, which of course also become more aesthetic than real testing pieces, because ultimately, because I wanted all these 17 pieces to fit into one method of research, you kind of test a lot of things that you ultimately don't really want to test, like let's say the quality of the plastic or the abrasion of the plastic. You ultimately also test. So at the moment, I'm thinking of really going back to where these 17 hypotheses come from and making a better testing method for each individual one, so I can actually make real proposals for footwear. But then, of course, this kind of rationalized approach to footwear design is one thing, but footwear is, of course, also a very cultural object. And so I've I also looked at different kind of associations that we have with footwear, like very clumsy, frivolous motions. And one thing that I did actually for the exhibition, I borrowed 2 Muybridge slides, which in Kingston there's a museum that has the largest collection of his work because he's lived there for a large part of his life. And I had the absolute pleasure of going to the museum and actually looking at these slides really up close. And first I thought, I know Muybridge, etc. But then I started looking quite closely. And well, one thing that every curator of Muybridge sees when they see these slides is, of course, the difference between how men, women, and animals are depicted. So, of course, the animals very clinic depiction of movement, really kind of as objective as you can get. But the men are all doing sports activities. They're boxing, they're running, they're jumping, they're doing all these kinds of things. And the women are doing absolute culturally informed activities. Some of them, so this is one of the slides, for example, that I borrowed, which contain activities that are not so objective and are also very particular, and some of them that just don't make sense in these kinds of slides. So, for example, here's the classic moment of a woman dropping a handkerchief, which of course is a kind of love play, which you do not do on your own. So there's this moment that is really kind of made up and acted out by just herself. And then there's this slide, which I also thought was very interesting, where you really kind of wonder how Muybridge instructed these women to act. Because here on the beginning you see this woman really pose, like she knows exactly how to be on the floor with her hand under her neck, on the floor, kind of lying elegantly. But then as the camera starts rolling, which I imagine was quite a kind of snap, snap, snap moment, she then needs to do something, and I don't quite. You kind of see in this image that she is aware of herself as a model, as someone acting, but then at the very end you see her kind of, so yeah, she's picking something from the floor, maybe a daisy, kind of ditzy thing, and then at the very end she just looks really clumsy, like just not knowing what the hell Muybridge might have wanted from her. So I think there's a really lovely kind of story behind it, and potentially also a link to kind of early fashion photography, or even the understanding of women, how they see themselves as these kind of cultural beings. So that was part of the gallery display. I had these 2 slides, but I also had other cultural references, which are actually a little bit more about the substrates that I talked about earlier. It was basically a series of film clips where shoes play a role. One of them, so I think the high-heeled woman is a very complex construct, and it's ultimately made for the man-made environment. It's not made for rural areas. It's really set up to work in very specific places. And as soon as you subject this woman to either different substrates or narrative, she starts to change her identity and change who she is. And of course, there's a lot of classic moments. So for example, this is A Night of the Living Dead. And it's this moment where there's a chase scene, and a woman falls, heel falls off, and she's really used to create suspense in the film. So here's the actual clip. I don't think I have. No, there's no sound on it.